Again, welcome tonight. I'd like to begin with a moment of prayer. So if you will join me for a prayer by Ted Loader. Let us pray. Go with me in a new exodus, O God of fire and freedom. Deliver me from my bondage to what can be counted, and go with me in a new exodus towards what counts, but can only be measured and bread shared and swords become plowshares. In bodies healed and minds liberated, in songs sung and justice done, in laughter in the night and joy in the morning, in all people coming together, and a kingdom coming in glory, in your name being praised, and my becoming an alleluia through Jesus Christ. Amen. Now it is my pleasure tonight to introduce to you our presenter, Jack Jezreel. Jack received his BA degree in religion and philosophy from Furman University in 1979 and his Master's of Divinity degree from the University of Notre Dame in 1982. From 1983 to 88, Jack was a member of a Catholic worker community, during which time he helped serve a soup kitchen and 3 hospitality houses for men and women who were experiencing homelessness. Jack also became interested in sustainability issues and has been involved in organic agriculture since 1985. Jack has worked for 40 years in justice education. For 8 of those years, Jack served as the Minister of Social Responsibility at the Church of Epiphany in Louisville, Kentucky, where he first developed the original JustFaith program, which would later be used in parishes and in churches across the country. In 1995, Jack received the Peace and Justice Award from the Archdiocese of Louisville, and in 2006 received the Roundtable of Social Action Directors Harry A. Fagan Award for his unique contribution to the church's mission. In 2014, he received the Franciscan Mission Service Anselm Moon's OFM Award in recognition of his contribution to the formation of new disciples for peace, justice, and hope. Jack is the original author of the JustFaith program and the founder of JustFaith Ministries, which creates and supports formation processes intended to inspire a commitment to social mission. He is a well-traveled speaker and teacher, lives in Louisville, Kentucky, and is married with Maggie, and they have 3 adult daughters and a grandson, Jack. Thank you for joining us, Jack. Welcome.
Well, thanks, Leela. And gosh, it's good to be with you all tonight. I'm delighted to spend a little bit of time together. The intent of the presentation tonight is really to try to be helpful to you somehow. I don't have a particular agenda except maybe I hope to say something that's helpful. And tonight, I'm going to do something a little different than maybe what a lot of our previous speakers have done. We have happily highlighted speakers who could address a particular issue of one kind or another. And tonight, what I'd like to do is sort of talk about the DNA of Christian community. For a lot of reasons. Part of it is, and I'll just share sort of a little bit about autobiography by way of introduction, is, as Leela mentioned, I have been a member of a Catholic worker community. I have been intimately connected with some major and significant national organizations. I've been on the board and have been an active member of several nonprofits, local. And I've had this somewhat remarkable and unique experience of being in a couple of Catholic parishes that had really strong commitments to social action, social mission. And I'm grateful for all those experiences, but I have to say that personally, the most life-giving of all those things, as grateful as I am for all of them, the most life-giving experience was the experience of being part of a church that was committed to social mission. And in fact, so much so that I'm tempted to say that when all the pieces are in the right place, the local church, if you're Catholic, the parish, if you're if you're, Baptist, your church, whatever denomination you come from. But I'm tempted to argue that the most potent possibility among the many that I know is really still the local church as an agent of social mission, as an agent of social transformation, as an agent of being God's vessel of grace and hope in the world. And so my intent tonight is try to speak to a version of local church that could inform and inspire new possibilities going forward. I'm going to draw tonight from Pope Francis heavily, and I know that not everybody on the call comes out of the Catholic experience, and I don't apologize for using Pope Francis, because in fact Pope Francis has always been in some ways an ecumenical man himself. He was well loved in his home country by people from all faith traditions, and spoke a word that was meant to inspire and encourage people from all faith traditions. So my hope tonight is that regardless of what faith tradition you come out of, what denomination you might come from, that you'll make application. That's really I think the point I'd want to make here is I come out of a particular unique experience, and so what I have to say is meant for you to, in some ways, to work with and to make useful for yourself. Part of the reason, too, that I wanted to speak to the topic I'd like to speak tonight is the elephant in the room, and just get it out of the way. The elephant in the room is that almost every single Christian denomination in the United States of America is losing members, and not slowly, quickly. And so unless all of us want to be the last remnant of Christian connection in your community, we're going to have to do something different. The best definition of insanity, of course, is to keep doing the same thing and expect something different to happen. And so what I'd like to propose tonight is that we think about a different template for church. And I also will say this, that let me start that sentence again. Anticipating what's going to be the first 5 questions when I'm done with the presentation, I'm going to start by answering those 5 questions, which are all the same. And the questions are all going to be some form of, Jack, I liked what you had to say, but either you're going to say, my pastor won't let this happen, or the congregation and the community will not let it happen. Okay? And I just want to let you know that I'm going to answer that objection almost at the very start. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and share my screen, which on a good day only takes me about 45 minutes. So pardon my lack of expertise here, but we'll give it a try. Let's see what happens. Leela, I can see you. Is that working? Oh, good. Great. So the topic for tonight, a dynamic church for a dynamic mission. I'm thinking of dynamic in contrast to static. A lot of what I'm going to suggest tonight is that much of the current DNA, much of the current assumptions about church life are actually static assumptions, that there's a static set of ingredients that inform what it means to be church, even a good church, and that in some ways it betrays the possibilities that I think are available to us. And I'm going to use Pope Francis as our guide tonight because he addresses the topic in such a remarkable way. I would argue, my friends, that of all the statements that Pope Francis has made, and he's made a lot, I would still argue that Joy of the Gospel, one of his first public writings, is still by far the most provocative. It's still the most, in some ways, world-changing, church-changing documents that I know of, and I want to spend some time with that. And so let me remind you a little bit of Francis's history. Number one, about 2 or 3 months after Francis was named Pope, he was meeting with a group of journalists. And one of the journalists in the room said, Pope Francis, what and it has an Italian, they were speaking in Italian, and it has a little bit of a nuance, but it was sort of like, what are you up to? What will your papacy be about? Now, from the reports, it went like this. You would have assumed that maybe Francis would pause and look ponderous, maybe turn his best side to the camera so that the camera could catch what was going to be a very important response to this important question. But in fact, he responded in a nanosecond. And what he said was, I want to complete Vatican II. Of course, many of the journalists in the room were surprised by the answer because, Vatican II was 50 years ago. Why that response? And but Pope Francis went on to explain that in his mind, Vatican II was not complete, and I happen to agree with him. In fact, my sisters and brothers, for those of you who are Catholic, and I would argue there's an application to be made into the Protestant experience, most of us living today are actually caught between two paradigms of church. We're living in a kind of liminal space. And I would say both constituency and leadership are caught in kind of a tussle between two possibilities of church. And so tonight, my argument is going to be in agreement with Pope Francis that our church is still, in fact, incomplete. The second observation I want to make about Pope Francis is that his name is Pope Francis, and not Francis Xavier, but Francis of Assisi. And the reason I bring that up is just to remind you of a seminal story of Saint Francis's life, which was that lovely story about him getting instructions from a crucifix at San Damiano, and the instructions were to, quote, rebuild the church. And that rebuilding was not a matter of a brick and mortar, of course. It was, in some ways, the recovery of the language and the notion of discipleship, walking in the footsteps of Jesus, embracing our brothers and sisters who found themselves in impoverished and marginalized places, living simply, loving the enemy, reverencing creation. That is embedded in this Pope's choice of a name is some assumption about that same kind of rebuilding experience in the 21st century. And I think we have to look at Francis's papacy through the lens of a man who feels called into the prospect of seeing a new church, a new kind of church emerge. And so in Francis's teaching, and especially, I think, in Joy of the Gospel, there is a most remarkable and stunning invitation that I think we would be well served to pay more attention to. So let me try to recover Francis's argument and contextualize this in the dynamic of this tension between Vatican I and Vatican II. Now, for those of you who are at least as old as I am, you have some memory. Those of you who are Catholic have some memory of Vatican I. And what I again want to suggest is that there's still a transition happening that is not complete. Now, I have done a lot of traveling over the years, and one of the things that will happen is I'll attend wherever I'm speaking. I might be there on a Sunday, attend liturgy at the church. I'll pick up a bulletin. The bulletin will often say something like this, St. Mary's Catholic Church, and then underneath it, it will say a Vatican II community. And I think, great. So I get the bulletin. And by the way, some of these bulletins read like the Sunday New York Times. They're 50 pages thick. It takes you all week to read it just so you can get it done in time to go to Mass the following Sunday. Anyway, so I start paging through these bulletins, and lots of things happening. And then I turn the last page and I say, I wish this was a Vatican II community, but it is not. It is, in fact, a Vatican I.5 community. And I actually mean that literally. And so that's the case I want to make tonight is this transition that is not in any way complete yet. So again, this is for those of you who may not be familiar with the Catholic story, Vatican I and Vatican II. I'm going to try to summarize this as quickly and easily as I can. There's lots of ways to describe this transition from Vatican I to Vatican II. One of the ways to speak to the transition, and I'm going to draw from those of you who are as old as I am about your memory of Vatican I, that most of us who are in our 60s and 70s and 80s who remember the Catholic Church, we became Catholic, or we were formed as Catholic probably via a tool that was used in almost every parish from 1890 up into the 1970s and beyond. And that ubiquitous tool that most of us know pretty well is called the Baltimore Catechism. Now, for those of you who aren't Catholic, the Baltimore Catechism was sort of a compendium of a lot of short, pithy questions with a lot of short, pithy answers. And in order to become Catholic, you had to sort of read it, learn it, memorize it, and then you were ready to be Catholic. And so that was the way it happened. And one of the questions in the Baltimore Catechism, it's considered one of the primary, seminal, foundational questions, was why did Christ found the church? Why did the church exist? What was the church's purpose? Implicit in the question was, what is the church's mission? What is the church's ministry? And the answer given to question 508 of the Baltimore Catechism was the church's work, the purpose of church, and these are the literal words, was to teach, to govern, and to sanctify. I see a lot of nodding heads out there of people who look like they're as old as I am. I'm really old. So in any event, this was a definition of what was considered to be active ministry, the active mission of the church. Now, to begin to understand what happens in Vatican II, one way to frame it and to capsulize it is Vatican II essentially asks two critical questions of the Vatican I Church, because it has some concerns about the vitality of the church. And the first question that it asks is simply, well, if the church's work is to teach, to govern, and to sanctify, who is actually doing this work? And my sisters and brothers, it's not a difficult question to answer. The answer was clergy. And by the way, this is not a criticism of clergy. This is just to make this rather simple mathematical observation. Less than 1% of the church is clergy. That means that less than 1% of the church are actively ministering, while the other 99-point-something% of the church are being ministered to. Now, again, notice there's nothing wrong with being ministered to. The problem, though, is if you define church as only being ministered to, then you end up with a church that assumes a passive posture toward its faith tradition. And in fact, for many Catholics, my memory, I think, serves well here, is that we went to church assuming we would be taken care of by the clergy, essentially. But Vatican II, you see, concludes with a very different answer to the question. Vatican II's answer to the question of who ministers is everybody, right? So starting in the 1960s, suddenly the church is saying everybody who's baptized is called to active ministry. And the impact of this was profound. My sisters and brothers, for those of you who are looking at me right now, I'm holding up a piece of paper because this is what the Sunday bulletin looked like in 1961. It was a page, had the mass times, might have had, baptism classes and a few other things. But this is what the beehive of the church looked like. It could be printed on a single page. Now you fast forward by 60 years. And as I mentioned, there are some churches that actually have, it's like a pamphlet of what's happening in the church that week. In other words, what I would argue, my friends, is that the transition from Vatican I to Vatican II related to the question, of who is called to active ministry is been recognized in a profound way. We have churches that look like beehives of activity. And one of the interesting things in my traveling around the country has been, no surprise here. I'll go to a church. The church will say, we're in the middle of a building campaign. Well, that's ubiquitous, it seems like. And most of the time, when churches were talking about that, decades ago, they were either building one of two things. They were either building a school or they were building another worship center. But in the last 10 to 15 to 20 years, when I asked the question, what are you building? They would often say a community center. We're building more space for the multiple ministries of our church to meet because we ran out of room. And so all of this is good news. Now to the difficult news. The second question that Vatican II asked Vatican I, and again, this is a conversation really, is also about this definition of teaching, governing to sanctifying. The second question was not who, but where. Where did this active ministry defined by Vatican I, teaching, governing, and sanctifying, actually happen? And the answer to that question was on parish property. So in other words, and maybe I can emphasize this by telling a little story about myself about the time of Vatican II, just before Vatican II happened. So I'm a little boy. I'm a member of a large Catholic family. Here was our Sunday morning. We would all hop in the station wagon. You remember a station wagon, right? It was like a football field on wheels. And one of the great things about a station wagon is it had no seat belts. At least that's what we thought. And so my brothers and sisters and I, we would presume, the station wagon had a front seat where mom and dad sat, and then there was a next seat, and then there was a third seat. And so what was great fun for us is we could take my youngest sister and we could pitch her from the second seat to the third seat, and from the third seat back to the second seat. And why did we do that? Because we could. And so it's a Sunday morning, we're going to church, we're pitching my sister back and forth over the second and third seat. We go by the high school, all pandemonium is happening in the car. We go by the railroad tracks, all tumult of every kind is happening in the back. We go by, the dairy curl, just about to get to the church, and it's complete chaos in the car. And then this is what happens, because all of my brothers and sisters and I, we all went to Catholic school and we knew the drill. The minute the front right tire touched the church parking lot, all of us in the car immediately went into military obedience mode and put our arms down by our side and immediately didn't say another word for the next hour to hour and 15 minutes. We would get out of the car single file, walk to the church in dead silence, push open the door. And this is what I remember as a little guy going to church on Sunday was I would walk into this space, and it was this most interesting of spaces because we had these large, beautiful stained glass windows. And on a Sunday morning, the sun would shine through, and the color in the space was unlike anything I had seen before. And then in our church, there would always be some kind of incense, smoke. Think about that. I said to my mom, can we do smoke at home? And she said, no, we could not do that. So only smoke in the church. And then we would start the prayers, and the prayers were always in Latin. And of course, as a young guy who went to Catholic school, I knew why we spoke Latin, because that's the language that God spoke. And so all this mystery, and of course, then there were special seats. And so, getting in the pews for a little guy, you kind of had to hang on for your life because the pew seats were kind of pushing you back. And all this sort of odd thing would happen for an hour and a half. And inside the church, there was this mysterious group of people. The men wore black with a white collar. The women wore black with sort of interesting head apparel. And it only happened on this church block. And I'm being silly here. There is a point and a conclusion to the story. So at the end of this very interesting hour of Latin, smoke, stained glass windows, and so forth, we would, at the end of a mass, stand up, leave, walk back to the car in single file, dead quiet, in the car quiet. But the minute the left front tire touched the road, we started pitching my sister back and forth over the second and third seats because, it was back to, and here's what I want you to hear. it was back to normal life. You see, for this young guy growing up in the Catholic tradition, Catholic faith was what happened on the parish block for an hour. That's what it meant to be a Catholic Christian in 1964 or whatever. And the point of that was that as a young kid who at the time thought he was going to be a priest, I knew where I was going to be spending all my time, on the holy block, on God's block, in the building called the church, doing the things that holy people do, which was on the parish block. And consequently, if you wanted to be a good Catholic, what it meant was spending a lot of time on the block, whether it was Mass on Sunday, Mass every day, helping clean up the church after Mass, but everything happened on the parish block. Now, in contrast to this definition of Vatican I, Vatican II comes up with a very different answer to the question. And the answer to the question about where is ministry to happen is everywhere. Suddenly, what we understand is that the responsibility of the church is to all people in all places. And so we began to understand that when we ask questions like, who is my sister or my brother? The proper response was everybody. Who am I responsible for? The answer was everybody. Who do I care about? The answer is everybody. And so there's this extraordinary transition. And now back to the problem. My friends, even now 60 years after Vatican II, there are parishes with the very fat bulletins in which there's 146 ministries described. And unfortunately, 144 of them happen on the parish block and are focused on the parish itself. In other words, this transition is incomplete because what Francis is hoping for is a church in which everybody, look at the slide, everybody is caring about everywhere. Another word to talk about that is, what does it mean to translate love into places all over the world? In some places it means solidarity, in some places it means compassion, in some places it means mercy, in some places it means accompaniment, in some places it means forgiveness, and so on and so forth. So what I'd like to do next, this is the frame that we find ourselves in. You and I are caught in churches that by and large recognize that everybody is called, but called to what? And so what I'd like to do is begin to look at some of Francis's own words from the Joy of the Gospel and see what we can make of it. So here's my first selected text. I'll read it out loud. I want to emphasize, this is Pope Francis writing, I want to emphasize that what I'm trying to express here has a programmatic significance and important consequences. I hope that all communities will devote the necessary effort to advancing along the path of a pastoral and missionary conversion, which cannot leave things as they presently are. The emphasis is mine, though the dark words at the end is my emphasis. But I emphasized it with a point. Francis has in mind that things have to change. And what I find interesting here is he's talking about programmatic significance and important consequences. While those words aren't necessarily very sexy, what Francis is hoping is that people will take these things to heart and actually make real changes. This is not just a papal statement that he hopes people put in a golden book and put on the shelf, but that this will actually have real consequences. Now, my sisters and brothers, one of the reasons that I use this slide to start with is because in the document, Joy of the Gospel, or Evangelii Gaudium, the word, notice on the second line from the bottom, the word missionary. In Joy of the Gospel, the word missionary or mission is mentioned 117 times in the text of the Joy of the Gospel. 117 times. It's clearly the highlight word. It's the point that Francis is trying to make. And I'm going to spend just a minute sharing with you what missionary means to Pope Francis. Now, look, missionary is a word that can have a lot of definitions, but here's what I want to emphasize for you. For a Latin American Jesuit, which is what Pope Francis is, for a Latin American Jesuit, the word mission means something very, very specific. It is not so elastic that it includes all things. So let me give you a sort of a snapshot of what the language of mission or missionary means here. Clearly, the language of mission speaks to, or missionary speaks to, someone who in some ways has voluntarily dislocated themselves. So let me try to paint a picture of that. If you can imagine your life in a home, in a neighborhood, in a church, in a community in which you have received a lot of love. Now, I realize not everybody gets that, but let's just imagine for a moment the best case scenario. So I'm at the dinner table with my friends, my family, my neighbors, my church that has loved me into being. And the beginning of the missionary moment starts with me standing up and looking around the table and saying, I'll be back. I'm going somewhere. And so I stand up from the table, and of course, this is an image, a metaphor. I stand up, I leave the place that I know and am loved and am secure, and I move. And I move my body, I move myself to a different place. Now, what guides my steps in this thing called the missionary project? What guides my step is a kind of water witch or spiritual compass. And the spiritual compass guides my steps in the same way that it guides the steps of Jesus. And that spiritual compass seems to draw me into the places where love has somehow been obstructed. Whether the obstruction is neglect or deprivation or oppression or whatever the case might be, I'm drawn into the place where human wounds are apparent. Now, in the Catholic social teaching world, we sometimes describe this as the option for the poor and vulnerable. Now, we describe it as a kind of ethical category, but my sisters and brothers, I think well before it's an ethical category, it's actually actually a description of spirituality. What happens in the human heart when I am drawn into the places where my brothers and sisters struggle and suffer? What happens that allows that to happen? And then when it does happen, what happens is I find myself naturally and compelled by the voice of those who struggle and suffer. And so the missionary dynamic is the movement from a place of relative comfort and security and protective community into places that you might not have guessed that I would go. And so I leave the community that's comfortable, and I simply find a place where I can, if you will, sit down at a different table and be with. Now, notice the language that I used. If you can imagine the kind of prototypical image of somebody leaving their comfortable home and going, and let's just pretend right now, because I know actually some of you on the call tonight have made your way to Haiti. So we'll just use that image. It's a fairly challenging one, and it's one that not everybody can do, but let's just imagine that for me. So I leave my home in Seattle, Washington, and I go to Haiti, and I simply place myself in the company of those who are there. Now, what I don't do, and this is really important, what I don't do is say, I'm here to help, and I think I can pretty much solve these problems because I've got enough money and I know how to make this happen. That's not what we do. We put ourselves in a place where we can simply be with and build relationships. In other words, the missionary adventure moves from a place of comfort to a place where there are wounds, and the next step is I simply plop down and begin to build relationships. And then, as some of you know from the language of Pope Francis, he's big on the language of encuentro, or encounter. And here's what encounter means to Pope Francis. It's what happens when you put yourself in a place and be with other people. So remember, in the life of Saint Francis, whom Pope Francis takes his name, in the life of Saint Francis, one of the pivotal encuentros or encounters of Saint Francis's life is his encounter with a leper, right? It's this experience of a rich dandy. Francis was a rich kid, and he has this experience of actually, coming face to face with somebody who's been pushed out of the community. Lepers had to live outside of the community, and he comes face to face with this leper. And the story goes that he gets off of his horse. Something compels him to embrace the leper. And in that embrace, Francis says, what before was unthinkable has become sweetness and light. The thing that all my life I've been trained to try to ignore is exactly where I will find God's presence. That's the substance and the content of encuentro, or encounter. What happens when human beings put themselves in a place where they can hear the voices of those they've not heard before, where they can see the eyes of those they've not seen before, when they can hear and experience the experiences of people who are in a very different position, in many cases in some kind, perhaps, of crisis, and be changed by what they learn in that encounter. And so, my sisters and brothers, here's the point. What Francis has in mind is a church renewed by the logic of missionary, notice that second to the last line, missionary conversion, right? The kinds of things that happen when we put ourselves in a place where we can see, if you will, the other, whatever the other, however you define the other, where we can see the other and begin to be transformed by the encounter. It's a mutual experience. It doesn't go one way. It's interactive. And so, I just want to highlight that when Francis thinks about a missionary conversion, he's thinking of a church that now is actively putting itself in a place where it can hear the voices it before could not hear, to see the eyes of those that had not been seen, to put themselves in places so that they can be responsive. And of course, again, to highlight, the first step is to simply put ourselves in those places and then build relationships. Okay, let me go on. The second quote that I've chosen from Pope Francis that builds on the first is, Francis says this: I dream of a missionary option. That is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything, the emphasis is mine, so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world rather than for her self-preservation. Now notice, he's talking about something that's transformational. Now, that's important. In other words, he's not saying, we're getting 8 out of 10 things right, so let's add a 9th thing and then it will all be complete. He's actually looking for something like, can I say it this way? If you have hydrogen and you want to add oxygen, you don't just get hydrogen and oxygen. You end up with something completely different called water. And that's, I think, what Francis has in mind here, that what we have described as the local church can be utterly transformed by a fresh ingredient like leaven, like adding a leavening into the baking process. It changes everything. If you don't have it, it doesn't change. And so, again, notice that Francis is thinking very practically here. He says he wants everything transformed, church's customs, ways of doing things, everything. And then also notice, my friends, near the end, he does give a little nudge. He talks about a church that is not dedicated to her self-preservation. Just interesting. Next quote. The renewal of structures demanded by pastoral conversion can be understood in this light as part of an effort to make them more mission-oriented, to make ordinary pastoral activity on every level more inclusive and open, to inspire in pastoral workers a constant desire to go forth, and in this way to elicit a positive response from all those whom Jesus summons to friendship with him. As John Paul II once said to the bishops of Oceania, all renewal in the church must have mission as its goal if it is not to fall prey to a kind of ecclesial introversion. I've never seen that phrase before, but it's just so good. Just think of a church sort of hunkering down and talking about how it's so happy to be saved and sort of keeping itself away from the rest of the world because they don't want to get, sullied by the dirtiness of the world. And Francis has a very, very, very different model in mind. Let me go on. Francis says this, and this is really an extraordinary statement. The parish, the local church, is not an outdated institution. Precisely because it possesses great flexibility, it can assume quite different contours depending on the openness and missionary creativity of the pastor and the community. While certainly not the only institution which evangelizes, if it proves capable of self-renewal and constant adaptivity, it continues to be the church living in the midst of the homes of her sons and daughters. This presumes that it really is in contact with the homes and the lives of its people and does not become a useless structure out of touch with people or a self-absorbed cluster made up of a chosen few. Well, a couple of things here. Before we look at that nudge at the bottom, let me just highlight something that's really remarkable about this statement. Let me start with the second line. You'll notice the word flexibility. On the third line, there's the word openness. On the fourth line, there's the word creativity. You jump down a few more lines, it talks about self-renewal and adaptivity. My friends, do you think that the Pope has something new in mind? I mean, all of this is an invitation for churches to rethink what they are through the lens of this remarkable invitation to be a missional church. And again, as Francis, as we've seen this already, he does take a moment just to say, look, at the last sentence, I don't have time for these churches that become self-preoccupied. They're just not, it's not gonna happen. And finally, the last one I'll admit here, last one I want to emphasize from Pope Francis is, Francis says this: we must admit, though, that the call to review and renew our churches, our parishes, has not yet sufficed to bring them nearer to people, to make them environments of living communion and participation, and to make them somewhat mission-oriented. I'm sorry, it doesn't say somewhat. I think it mostly mission-oriented. Oh, no, it doesn't say that either. It says completely mission-oriented. That's what it says. Our churches are to be completely mission-oriented. Let me just make sure you got that. See, completely, entirely, completely mission-oriented parish or church. And just to make sure you get it, not self-oriented, right? You see, what Francis has in mind here is really stunning, and it's like an invitation to every church and parish in the world to think about, hey, let's experiment. Let's try some new things. Let's see what works. Let's talk about what works. What does it mean to become a missionally driven church? And let's just explore the possibilities and then be in conversation, because Francis has given pastors of churches a very, very long leash by which to do some creative things. So what I'd like to do, kind of in closing, is to give you some of the ideas that come to my mind about what would it mean to make the transition from completely mission to completely mission oriented. And what I have in mind here is from a thing that most of us have known, whatever church you have known, to something that includes this missional ingredient. And I want to emphasize that a lot of what a lot of us have known is not a bad thing. The problem is it's incomplete. And when something is incomplete, it's not what it should be. And again, what I have in mind here is, as we think about the transition from to also. That again, we use that image of hydrogen and oxygen. You have hydrogen, whatever we've had. If you add this new ingredient, you don't just get an additional ingredient to everything you were doing before. It actually is going to change everything. Everything is going to be made new by this fresh commitment. So what I have in mind here, for example, if the church that most of us has known has focused on how to equip people to be part of the church, part of the sanctuary, part of the gathering place, to participate in what happens on the church block, which are essentially things like sacraments, worship, community prayer, Bible studies, whatever it is, that's all fine. It's just profoundly incomplete. So in addition, what we need are communities that are equipping people to heal and make holy the world. In other words, as much attention in churches should be spent on equipping people to be light and leaven for the world as it is how do they behave on a Sunday morning at church. Are you with me? And I don't mean to demean any of that. It's just that when you add these two things together, you end up with something very different, something very life-giving, so that the experience of being a people committed to healing and making holy the world will change the way you pray. It will change the way you gather on a Sunday. It will change the focus of the church itself. On we go. From religious education models that were focused on life on church property, in the case of Catholics, primarily sacramental church, in some cases of other Christian traditions, maybe the Bible or whatever, to also religious education that focuses as much on the human and global reality. So think of how Pope Francis releases an encyclical on the environment called Laudato Si. In other words, when we think about religious education, we're not only talking about what does the Bible say and what does church teaching say, and but also what's the world look like? What are the world's needs, and how do we integrate that into our very sense of understanding ourselves as a Christian community? From the parish as a place of the pastoral care of its members. Look, this is a good thing. Isn't it nice? Some of you probably have had this experience like I have. I had cancer almost 20 years ago. And every day the church would show up with, 6 casseroles. And it was great because, my wife didn't have to cook, and it was wonderful. But to add to that, the church, the parish, not just a place of the care of its own members, but a place of prophetic urgency for the poor and vulnerable who may or may not be part of the parish or the neighborhood. In other words, when we talk about who are our people, it's not just the people who have the same membership in the church. Our people is everybody. Let me go on. When we think about church renewal, right now, in every denomination that I know of, there's some products being sold that talk about church renewal. And a lot of them, quite frankly, are emphasizing, how to have more greeters at the door when people come to church, and how to include, some kind of social events that are tied to worship on Sunday so that people like to spend more time there, and so on and so forth. And when I think of church renewal, I think about emphasizing the empowerment piece that we talked about in the language of mission. How do any one of us come to a place when we feel compelled to leave the comfortable, to leave the safe, to leave the prudent, and make the choice to be with in places that may be unfamiliar to us, and in some cases might actually pose some kind of threat or danger to our lives, like they do in places like Haiti and many other places. And I don't mean to emphasize you getting on a plane and going to a different country to talk about being missional. Being missional can be as simple as going across the street to be with the elderly man who is dying of cancer. So there's a lot of ways to be missional here. Evangelization. I think we thought of evangelization as a way of trying to get people to our church. We want to convert you to becoming Baptist or Methodist or Lutheran or Catholic or whatever it is. And I think, my brothers and sisters, when we think about evangelization, a la the story of Jesus, what we're really talking about is how do we engage people in the missional geography and the active care of Jesus. In other words, when we truly evangelize something, I think we do it while we're actually walking down the road. So the way evangelization happens, for those of you who can see, who can look at the screen for a moment, I'm going to use a gesture. The way I understand Jesus to evangelize looks like this. He's walking this way and he's doing this. He's saying, let's go. I've got someplace to go. Have you noticed, my friends, that the gospel is nothing but a travel log? It's nothing but Jesus moving around, and he keeps inviting people to move with him. And where do we go? We go wherever we're needed. Let me move on. We've talked about a familiar language for us is church going. Where do you go to church? And we're talking about, in some ways, what building do you go to on a Sunday morning? That's fine. It's okay. It's just not enough. Because I think when we talk about church going, what I really think we ought to be talking about is, if you can imagine, the community of faith gathered on a Sunday morning, and the pastor comes up to the front and says this: where is the church going this week? Meaning, this missional church, when it leaves here, it'll be going to all different kinds of places in order to build relationships. So where are we going this week? Of course, it's very familiar to us that if we want to pray, the sanctuary is a good place to pray and discern. And we've often thought that a good place to go, if people sometimes say, what should I do next? What should I do next? What should I do next? So they go to the church, which is fine. But I think there's also a complementary, powerful tool that we sometimes miss out on. And that's the prayer and discernment in the streets. Let me give you an example. About 10 years ago, I was invited by a good friend in the Oakland area to come to their community to do a presentation. And while I was there, the bishop of Oakland was inviting the community to vigil in a neighborhood that had just seen a whole string of drive-by shootings. And the idea was that we would simply walk through the community with signs that said, we are with you, we care about you, as an act of solidarity, to pray as we moved. And so as we walked the streets, I remember it well. It's like a lot of major cities, a lot of boarded up homes, a lot of disrepair, a lot of desperation obvious in the space. And if you were to get on your knees at that moment and say, Lord, what am I to do? The answer, one of the answers that probably would have come to you would be, how do I help here? How do I help here? Now, if your church is located next to the golf course and you're on the 10th tee and you get down on your knees before you drive down the fairway and you say, Lord, what am I to do? I don't know what answer you're going to get. In other words, part of our prayer is osmotic. We take in what we know, we take in what's around us. And in that context, we pray, and in that context, we can get answers. But if we put ourselves in a place where we've separated ourselves from the other, then the likelihood is that our prayers will be difficult for our prayers to be answered. From the assumption that people move from prayer to action, that's true, but it's also true that people move from action to prayer. My sisters and brothers, some of you might know this story if you've been involved in JustFaith Ministries programming. But after several years of offering what was originally just a single program called JustFaith, we started hearing from all kinds of people that, I need a prayer resource. I need something that will sustain me in the work that I'm doing that I've never done before. Help me, for example, figure out, how do I develop a deep spiritual well so that I can look at the suffering that I'm now encountering and not just get dispirited or angry or crabby, right? And so out of that experience, quite frankly, was the opportunity to do the program called Engaging Spirituality, which was a tool created to help people who were trying to do the missional work of justice and compassion. From not only membership, right? Look, everybody, all of us like to be members of something. We like to be in a place that knows us and we're familiar with, and people are our friends, and all that's a good thing. But also discipleship, this language of being on the road. Let me say this: there's really two ways to be, or there's two poles about how to be a faithful Christian. Let me give you an example. My mom, when she was marrying my dad, converted to Catholicism. And when she went to become a Catholic, the priest essentially, she told this story. She said, the priest said, now, if you want to be a good Catholic, you have to come to church every Sunday, come to the parish here, come to the parish and join us for Mass every Sunday. And if you're a really good Catholic, you'll come during the week. And if you're a really good Catholic, you'll come on Tuesday nights to help us with this. And in other words, all the language was come to the sanctuary. And then another way to be Christian, I suppose, I'll just use a name that probably most of us know, Mother Teresa. So Mother Teresa spends her life on the streets of Calcutta caring for dying poor people, literally on the road. And if I asked you the question, when you look at the gospel, when you read the story of Jesus, is Jesus a sanctuary guy or is Jesus a road guy? There's only one answer possible. He's a road guy. He has a respect for his religious tradition. He respects the sanctuary, the temple, but he's a road guy. He invites people to the road with him. Let me go back one. Leadership as the caretaker of people on the church block, that's a good thing. But as we think about this transition, we also want to think about leadership as the caretaker of all God's people and the leader of a particular community called a church who are going to love and heal that world together. From the church or the parish as a hangout to the church as a launching pad, which basically catapults me into the world. And then just because all of us were aware that a few years ago, the Pope declared a year of mercy, and a lot of people studied mercy. I think 7 or 8 people across the country did their dissertations on mercy, and maybe about 50 or 60 parishes actually studied mercy as part of the year of mercy. That's all a good thing. But ultimately, I think what Pope Francis was hoping for is the practice of mercy. And isn't it nice to have somebody who walks the talk in the case of Pope Francis? In conclusion, let me just offer this observation, that Pope Francis has this vision. I think it's informed by St. Francis. Let me stop the screen share here for just a second. I'm sorry. Let's see. Pope Francis has this vision. It's based upon his reading of St. Francis. And I just want to highlight this point, that the rebuilding of the church related to St. Francis started with, not in a church, not with a clergy guy, just with someone who decided to do the right thing. And so I want to say to those of you on the call tonight this, that if you find yourself in a place where your church is not going to accommodate a new possibility, then the option that's available to every one of us is to get started. It's just to get started. If that means gathering a group of like-minded people around you and simply doing what St. Francis did, which was to begin to pray together, walk and talk with integrity, make commitments together, and in some ways fashion and model a new way for the church to be church, then so be it. Nobody can stop you from doing that. It's wonderful if it happens in a parish or a church. It's wonderful. It's great. Do it. And at the same time, if it's not happening, don't censor yourself because it's not happening with somebody's permission. You have permission. You have, in some ways, the commission. You have the invitation to make the steps with a group of people who you can work with, love with, pray with, be with, minister with, and get to work. Leila, I think that's it. So I'm glad to take questions if there are any. Susie, I think you were looking at the questions if there are any, and I'll be glad to try to.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. Lovely as always. Really inspiring and compelling message. Of course, one of the questions that came through is about the difficult priest or pastor who's making it nearly impossible. Your very first opening statement. But But maybe to take that a little bit differently and just ask for some wisdom around this, Jack, like Pope Francis, who is modeling his ministry after St. Francis, who I have a particular affinity to. Francis had that springboard effect too, like his ministry and his prayer life in the hillsides of Assisi. Springboarded him into the middle of the marketplace to be with people, and most particularly people in need. From your perspective, Jack, what are some of the missing ingredients to building the springboard? So that's a question that I have for you. How do you get the spring in the springboard again?
Susie, I could mention two things, I think, and I'll start with the one I think that is most powerful. I'll say it this way. I'll use the image of Haiti just because if somebody said, Jack, I got a ticket to Haiti. Do you want to go by yourself? I would say, no, I don't want to go by myself. But if somebody said, Jack, there's 9 of us going to Haiti. Would you like to go with us? Then I say, yes. In other words, Susie, for me, the energy is in the community. The strength, the antidote to fear is community. The possibility of being held accountable is community. The community is where friendship happens. Community is where intimacy happens. Community is where love and forgiveness can happen in a microcosm. Community is the place where people, when they put their hearts and minds and spirits together, can come up with creative possibilities for the whole. Community is where, when prayer is shared, the community is made more lively and energetic. So my first step for almost everybody is discover, find, build, create, lean into community. And then right after that, as you mentioned it, is there needs to be some kind of attention to my inner world. We call it prayer or spirituality or spiritual practice or whatever, but it's really important that people are spending time being self-aware and inviting their hearts into the conversation with each other. So that's my 2 first steps: community, and that's why I think church. That's why I started off by saying, for me, the experience of being in a church in which people were committed to each other, committed to social mission, committed to prayer, and committed to donuts was like the secret sauce. When you put all those things together, you can do some really remarkable things. And that's why I feel like for so many churches of all kinds, it's not that the church has been tried and found wanting. The church is still waiting to be tried. There's still, in some ways, what really constitutes following Jesus together has yet to be really taken seriously. And so that's the encouragement tonight.
Maybe just one more question, Jack, and then we'll wrap up. What would you say to people who, and I hear this often, and many of you, I'm sure, will be able to relate to this. What would you say to people who say, my church or the church is irrelevant?
Well, in some cases, it could be true. Well, look, it is possible for the church to become irrelevant. In fact, in the quotes that I mentioned from Pope Francis tonight, he clearly describes what it means for the church to become irrelevant. When it becomes self-preoccupied, it's no longer an agent of transformation. So here's a couple of words of encouragement related to church. If I was offering particular advice to somebody, my counsel is find that faith community that you can love with, pray with, become close to, do work with, engage, and stay connected to the larger church. Because there are possibilities. I can tell stories of churches that were empowered, that became different, that started doing some dynamic things that they hadn't done before. It is possible. And I would say, related to those of you who struggle with either parishioners or members of your congregation, or a pastor who is reluctant. And the only thing I know to say is invite, 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 and invite again. Keep inviting. And I don't mean just into a conversation. I mean, invite them into an experience of, if you will, a missional voluntary dislocation, of actually moving our bodies into a different place to be able to hear the voices and to see the eyes and to touch the hands of those who we may not have ever seen before, and to see what happens to us. Because, like, I don't think Saint Francis went into the embrace with the leper thinking it was the first thing he wanted to do that day. But in fact, it ended up being the transformative moment of his life. And so, like so many of us, that's the case, right? When we've had the experience of interacting with the other, and it changes everything we thought we might do with our life. It changes how we live. So.
Thank you so very much, Jack. I think we're out of time. Before I turn it back over to Leela, I'm just going to butt into the meeting here because I see so many folks who have supported JustFaith Ministries for decades. And I take every opportunity I can to say thank you. So thank you for all of you who have ridden these 20 years with us as donors, as supporters, as facilitators, as participants, as people that we just like to hang out with. Thank you. Thank you. And Leela.
Great. Thank you, Susie. And thank you, Jack. I would like to close our time together with prayer. So if you will join me in a moment of prayer. I need to breathe deeply. Eternal friend, grant me an ease to breathe deeply of this moment, this light, this miracle of now. Beneath the din and fury of great movements and harsh news and urgent crisis, make me attentive, still to good news, to small occasions, and the grace of what is possible for me to do and be. To give, to receive, that I may miss neither my neighbor's gifts nor my enemy's needs. Amen. Thank you for joining us and have a great evening.